Good evening. A president of the Board of Civil Office, named Yin, and a native of Li Cheng, when a young man, was very badly off, but was endowed with considerable physical courage. Now, in this part of the country there was a large establishment covering several acres, with an unbroken succession of pavilions and verandas, and belonging to one of the old county families. But because ghosts and apparitions were frequently seen there, the place had for a long time remained untenanted, and was overgrown with grass and weeds, no one venturing to enter in, even in broad daylight. One evening, when Yen was carousing with some fellow students, one of them jokingly said, "If anybody will pass a night in the haunted house, the rest of us will stand him a dinner." Mr. Yen jumped up at this and cried out, "What is there difficult in that?" So, taking with him a sleeping mat, he proceeded thither, escorted by all his companions as far as the door, where they laughed and said, "We'll wait here a little while. In case you see anything, shout out to us at once." "If there are any goblins or foxes," replied Yin, "I'll catch them for you." He then went in and found the paths obliterated by long grass which had sprung up, mingled with weeds of various kinds. It was just the time of the new moon, and by its feeble light he was able to make out the door of the house. Feeling his way, he walked on until he reached the back pavilion, and then went up onto the moon terrace, which was such a pleasant spot that he determined to stop there. Gazing westwards, he sat for a long time looking at the moon, a single thread of light embracing in its horns the peak of a hill, without hearing anything at all unusual. So, laughing to himself at the nonsense people talked, he spread his mat upon the floor, put a stone under his head for a pillow, and lay down to sleep. He had watched the cowherd and the lady until they were just disappearing, and was on the point of dropping off, when suddenly he heard footsteps down below, coming up the stairs. Pretending to be asleep, he saw a servant enter, carrying in his hand a lotus-shaped lantern, who, on observing Mr. Yen, rushed back in a fright and said to someone behind, "There is a stranger here." The person spoken to asked who it was, but the servant did not know. And then up came an old gentleman who, after examining Mr. Yen closely, said, "It's the future president. He's as drunk as can be. We needn't mind him. Besides, he's a good fellow and won't give us any trouble." So they walked in and opened all the doors, and by there were a great many other people moving about, and quantities of lamps were lighted till the place was as light as day. About this time, Mr. Yen slightly changed his position and sneezed, upon which the old man, perceiving that he was awake, came forward and fell down on his knees, saying, "Sir, I have a daughter who is to be married this very night. It was not anticipated that your honor would be here. I pray, therefore, that we may be excused." Mr. Yin got up and raised the old man, regretting that, in his ignorance of the festive occasion, he had brought with him no present. "Ah, sir," replied the old man, "your very presence here will ward off all noxious influences, and that is quite enough for us." He then begged Mr. Yin to assist in doing the honors, and thus double the obligation already conferred. Mr. Yin readily assented, and went inside to look at the gorgeous arrangements they had made. He was here met by a lady, apparently about 40 years of age, whom the gentleman introduced as his wife, and he had hardly made his bow when he heard the sound of flageolets, and someone came hurrying in, saying, "He has come." The old gentleman flew out to meet this personage, and Mr. Yen also stood up, awaiting his arrival. In no long time, a bevy of people with gauze lanterns ushered in the bridegroom himself, who seemed to be about 17 or 18 years old, and of a most refined and prepossessing appearance. The old gentleman bade him pay his respects first to their worthy guest, and upon his looking towards Mr. Yin, that gentleman came forward to welcome him on behalf of the host. Then followed ceremonies between the old man and his son-in-law, and when these were over, they all sat down to supper. Hosts of waiting maids brought in profuse quantities of wine and meats, with bowls and cups of jade or gold, till the table glittered again. And when the wine had gone round several times, the old gentleman told one of the maids to summon the bride. This she did, but some time passed and no bride came. So the old man rose and drew aside the curtain, pressing the young lady to come forth, whereupon a number of women escorted out the bride, whose ornaments went tinkle tinkle as she walked along, sweet perfumes being all the time diffused around. Her father told her to make the proper salutation, after which she went and sat by her mother. Mr. Yin took a glance at her and saw that she wore on her head beautiful ornaments made of kingfisher's feathers, her beauty quite surpassing anything he had ever seen. All this time they had been drinking their wine out of golden goblets big enough to hold several pints, when it flashed across him that one of these goblets would be a capital thing to carry back to his companions in evidence of what he had seen. So he secreted it in his sleeve and, pretending to be tipsy, leaned forward with his head upon the table as if going to sleep. "The gentleman is drunk," said the guests, and by Mr. Yin heard the bridegroom take his leave, and there was a general trooping downstairs to the tune of a wedding march. When they were all gone, the old gentleman collected the goblets, one of which was missing, though they hunted high and low to find it. Someone mentioned the sleeping guest, but the old gentleman stopped him at once for fear Mr. Yin should hear, and before long silence reigned throughout. Mr. Yin then arose. It was dark, and he had no light, but he could detect the lingering smell of the food, and the place was filled with the fumes of wine. Faint streaks of light now appearing in the east, he began quietly to make a move, having first satisfied himself that the goblet was still in his sleeve. Arriving at the door, he found his friends already there, for they had been afraid that he might come out after they left and go in again early in the morning. When he produced the goblet, they were all lost in astonishment, and, on hearing his story, they were fain to believe it, well knowing that a poor student like Yin was not likely to have such a valuable piece of plate in his possession. Later on, Mr. Yin took his doctor's degree and was appointed magistrate over the district of Fei Chiu, where there was an old established family of the name of Chu. The head of the family asked him to a banquet in honor of his arrival, and ordered the servants to bring in the large goblets. After some delay, a slave girl came and whispered something to her master, which seemed to make him very angry. Then the goblets were brought in, and Mr. Yin was invited to drink. He now found that these goblets were precisely the same shape and pattern as the one he had at home, and at once begged his host to tell him where he had had these made. "Well," said Mr. Chu, "there should be 8 of them. An ancestor of mine had them made when he was a minister at the capital by an experienced artificer. They have been handed down in our family from generation to generation, and have now been carefully laid by for some time, but I thought we would have them out today as a compliment to your honor. However, there are only 7 to be found. None of the servants can have touched them, for the old seals of 10 years ago are still upon the box, unbroken. I don't know what to make of it." Mr. Yin laughed and said, "It must have flown away. Still, it is a pity to lose an heirloom of that kind, and as I have a very similar one at home, I shall take it upon myself to send it to you." When the banquet was over, Mr. Yin went home, and, taking out his own goblet, sent it off to Mr. Chu. The latter was somewhat surprised to find that it was identical with his own, and hurried away to thank the magistrate for his gift, asking him at the same time how it had come into his possession. Mr. Yin told him the whole story, which proves conclusively that although a fox may obtain possession of a thing, even at a distance of many hundred miles, he will not venture to keep it altogether.
You see, there was a waver lived once upon a time in Duleek here, hard by the gate, and a very honest, industrious man he was by all accounts. Well, It was one morning that his housekeeper called to him, and he sitting very busy throwing the shuttle, and says she, "Your breakfast is ready." "Leave me alone," says he. "I'm busy with a pattern here that is breaking my heart, and until I complete and master it entirely, I won't quit." "Oh, think of the elegant stirabout that'll be spoilt entirely." "To the devil with the stirabout," says he. "God forgive you," says she, "for cursing your good breakfast." Well, he left the loom at last and went over to the stirabout, and what would you think, but when he looked at it, it was black as a crow, for, you see, it was in the height of summer, and the flies lit upon it to the degree that the stirabout was fairly covered with them. "Why, then, bad luck to your impudence," says the waver. "Would no place serve you but that? And is it spoiling my breakfast yez are, you dirty bastards?" And with that, being altogether crooked-tempered at the time, he lifted his hand and made one great slam at the dish of stirabout and killed no less than 70 flies at one blow. It was 70 exactly, for he counted the carcasses one by one and laid them out on a clean plate for to view them. Well, he felt a powerful spirit rising in him when he seen the slaughter he done at one blow, and with that he got conceited as the very dickens, and not a stroke more work would he do that day, but out he went and was fractious and impotent to everyone he met, and was squaring up in their faces and saying, "Look at that fist, that's the fist that killed 70 at one blow. Ho! It is throwing away me time I have been all my life," says he. "Stuck to my loom, nothing but a poor waver, when it is St. George or the Dragon I ought to be, which is 2 of the 7 champions of Christendom. I'm determined on it, and I'll set off immediately and be a knight errant." Well, sure enough, he went out among his neighbours the next day, and he got an old kittle from one, and a saucepan from another, and he took them to the tailor, and he sewed him up a shout of tin clothes like any knight errant. And he borrowed a pot lid, and that he was very particular about, because it was his shield. And he went to a friend of his, a painter and a glazier, and made him paint on a shield in big letters, "I'm the man of all men that killed 70 at a blow." "When the people sees that," says the waver to himself, "the sorry one will dare for to come near me." And with that he told the housekeeper to scour out the small iron pot for him. "For," says he, "it will make an elegant helmet." And when it was done, he put it on his head, and says she, "Is it putting a great heavy iron pot on your head you're about, by way of a hat?" "Certainly," says he, "for a knight errant should always have a weight on his brain." "But," says she, "there's a hole in it, and it can't keep out the weather." "It will be the cooler," says he, putting it on him. "Besides, if I don't like it, it is easy to stop it with a wisp of straw or the like of that." "The 3 legs of it looks mighty queer sticking up," says she. "Every helmet has a spike sticking out of the top of it," says the waver, "and if mine has 3, it's only the grander it is." "Well," says the housekeeper, getting better at last, "all I can say is, it isn't the first sheep's head that was dressed in it." "Your servant, ma'am," says he, and off he set. Well, he was in want of a horse, and so he went to a field hard by where the miller's horse was grazing that used to carry the ground corn round the country. "This is the identical horse for me," says the waver. "He is used to carrying flour and mail, and what am I but the flower of chivalry in a coat of mail, so the horse won't be put out of his way in the least." But as he was riding him out of the field, who should see him but the miller? "Is it stealing my horse you are, honest man?" says the miller. "No," says the waver, "I'm only going to exercise him," says he. "In the cool of the evening, it will be good for his health." "Thank you kindly," says the miller, "but leave him where he is, and you'll oblige me." "I can't afford it," says the waver, running the horse at the ditch. "Bad luck to your impudence," says the miller. "You've as much tin about you as a travelling tinker, but you've more brass. Come back here, you vagabond," says he. But he was too late. Away galloped the waver and took the road to Dublin, for he thought the best thing he could do was go to the King of Dublin, for Dublin was a great place then and had a king of its own, and he thought maybe the King of Dublin would give him work. Well, he was 4 days going to Dublin, for the baste was not the best, and the roads worse, not all as one as now, but there were no turnpikes then, glory be to God. When he got to Dublin, he went straight to the palace, and when he got into the courtyard, he let his horse go and graze about the place, for the grass was growing out between the stones. Everything was flourishing then in Dublin, you see. Well, the king was looking out his drawing-room window for diversion when the waver came in. But the waver pretended not to see him, and he went over to a stone sate under the windy, for you see there were stone sates all round about the place for the accommodation of the people, for the king was a decent obliging man. Well, as I said, the waver went over and lay down on one of the sates just under the king's windy and pretended to go asleep, but he took care to turn out the front shield that had the letters on it. Well, my dear, with that, the king calls out to one of the lords of his court that was standing behind him, holding up the skirt of his coat, according to reason, and says he, "Look here," says he, "what do you think of a vagabond like that coming under my very nose to go to sleep? It is true I am a good king," says he, "and accommodate the people by having seats for them to sit down and enjoy the recreation and contemplation, seeing me here looking out of my drawing-room window for diversion. But that is no reason they are to make a hotel of the place and come and sleep here. Who is it at all?" says the king. "Not a one of me knows, please your majesty." "I think he must be a foreigner," says the king, "because his dress is outlandish." "And he doesn't know manners more betoken," says the lord. "I'll go down and circumspect him myself," says the king. "Follow me," says he to the lord, waving his hand at the same time in the most dignacious manner. Down he went accordingly, followed by the lord, and when he went over to where the waver was lying, sure, the first thing he seen was his shield with the big letters on it, and with that, says he to the lord, "By dad," says he, "this is the very man I want." "For what, please your majesty?" says the lord. "To kill that vagabond dragon, to be sure," says the king. "Sure, do you think he could kill him?" says the lord, "when all the stoutest knights in the land wasn't equal to it, but never came back, and was ate up alive by the cruel deceiver?" "Sure, don't you see there," says the king, pointing at the shield, "that he killed 70 at one blow, and the man that done that, I think, is a match for anything." So with that, he went over to the waver and shook him by the shoulder for to wake him. And the waver rubbed his eyes as if just wakened, and the king says to him, "God save you," said he. "God save you kindly," says the waver, pretending he was quite unknowns to who he was speaking to. "Do you know who I am?" says the king, "that you make so free, good man?" "No, indeed," says the waver, "you have the advantage of me." "To be sure I have," says the king, mighty high. "Sure, ain't I the king of Dublin?" says he. The waver dropped down on his 2 knees forninst the king, and says he, "I beg God's pardon and yours for the liberty I took. Please your holiness, I hope you'll excuse it." "No offence," says the king. "Get up, good man. And what brings you here?" says he. "I'm in want of work, please your reverence," says the waver. "Well, suppose I give you work," says the king. "I'll be proud to serve you, my lord," says the waver. "Very well," says the king. "You killed 70 at one blow, I understand," says the king. "Yes," says the waver. "That was the last trifle of work I done, and I'm afeard my hand'll go out of practice if I don't get some job to do at once." "You shall have a job immediately," says the king. "It's not 70 or any fine thing like that. It's only a blackguard dragon that is disturbing the country and ruinating my tenantry with eating their poultry, and I'm lost for want of eggs," says the king. "Troth, then, please your worship," says the waver, "you look as yellow as if you'd swallowed 12 yolks this minute." "Well, I want this dragon to be killed," says the king. "It will be no trouble in life to you, and I'm only sorry it isn't better worth your while, for he isn't worth fearing at all. Only I must tell you that he lives in the county Galway, in the midst of a bog, and he has an advantage in that." "Oh, I don't value it in the least," says the waver, "for the last 70 I killed was in a soft place." "When will you undertake the job, then?" says the king. "Let me at him at once," says the waver. "That's what I like," says the king. "You're the very man for my money," says he. "Talking of money," says the waver, "by the same token, I want a threefold change for you for my travelling charges." As much as you please, says the king, and with the word he brought him into his closet, where there was an old stocking in an oak chest bursting with golden guineas. Take as many as you please, says the king. And sure enough, my dear, the little waver stuffed his tin clothes as full as they could hold with him. Now I'm ready for the road, says the waver. Very well, says the king, but you must have a fresh horse, says he. With all my heart, says the waver, who thought he might as well exchange the miller's old garron for a better. And maybe it's wondering you are that the waver would think of going to fight the dragon after what he heard about him when he was pretending to be asleep. But he had no such notion. All he intended was to fob the gold and ride back again to Duleek with his gains and a good horse. But you see, cute as the waver was, the king was cuter still, for these high quality, you see, is great deceivers. And so, the horse the waver was put on was learned on purpose, and sure, the minute he was mounted, away powdered the horse, and the devil a toe he'd go but right down to Galway. Well, for 4 days he was going evermore, until at last the waver seen a crowd of people running as if old Nick was at their heels, and they shouting 1,000 murders and crying, "The dragon! The dragon!" And he couldn't stop the horse, nor make him turn back, but away he pelted right forninst the terrible beast that was coming up to him, and there was the most nefarious smell of sulphur saving your presence, enough to knock you down, and faith, the waver seen he had no time to lose, and so he threw himself off the horse and made to a tree that was growing nigh hand, and away he clambered up onto it as nimble as a cat. And not a minute had he to spare, for the dragon came up in a powerful rage, and he devoured the horse, body and bones in less than no time. And then he began to sniffle and scent about for the waver, and at last he clapped his eye on him where he was up in the tree, and says he, "In troth, you might as well come down out of that," says he, "for I'll have you as sure as eggs is mate." "Devil a foot I'll go down," says the waver. "Sorra care I care," says the dragon, "for you're as good as ready money in me pocket this minute, for I'll lie under this tree," says he, "and sooner or later you must fall to my share." And sure enough, he sat down and began to pick his teeth with his tail after the heavy breakfast he made that morning, for he ate a whole village, let alone the horse. And he got drowsy at last and fell asleep. But before he went to sleep, he wound himself all round the tree, all as one a lady winding a ribbon round her finger, so that the waver could not escape. Well, as soon as the waver knew he was dead asleep by the snoring of him, and every snore he let out of him was like a clap of thunder, the minute the waver began to creep down the tree as cautious as a fox, and he was very nigh hand to the bottom when, bad cess to it, a thieving branch he was depending on broke, and down he fell right atop the dragon. But if he did, good luck was on his side, for where should he fall but with his 2 legs right across the dragon's neck, and, my jewel, he laid hold of the beast's ears, and there he kept his grip, for the dragon wakened and endeavoured for to bite him, but you see, by raising the waver was behind his ears he could not come at him. And with that he endeavoured for to shake him off, but the devil of a stir could he stir the waver, and though he shook all the scales on his body, he could not turn the scale again the waver. "By the hokey, this is too bad entirely," says the dragon. "But if you won't let go," says he, "by the powers of wildfire, I'll give you a ride that'll astonish your 7 small senses, my boy." And with that, away he flew like mad, and where do you think he did fly? By Todd, he flew straight for Dublin, devil a less. But the waver being on his neck was a great distress to him, and he would rather have made him an inside passenger. But anyway, he flew and he flew till he came slap up again the palace of the king, for, being blind with the rage, he never seen it, and he knocked his brains out, that is, the small trifle he had, and down he fell speechless. And you see, good luck would have it that the King of Dublin was looking out of his drawing room window for diversion that day also, and when he seen the waver riding and the fiery dragon, for he was blazing like a tar barrel, and he called out to his courtiers to come and see the show. "By the powders of water, here comes the knight-errant," says the king, "riding the dragon that's all afire, and if he gets into the palace, yous must be ready with the fire engines," says he, "for to put him out." But when they seen the dragon fall outside, they all run downstairs and scampered into the palace yard for to circumspect the curiosity, and by the time they got down, the waver had got off the dragon's neck, and, running up to the king, says he, "Please your holiness," says he, "I do not think myself worthy of killing this vexatious beast, so I brought him to yourself for to do him the honour of decapitation by your own royal 5 fingers. But I tamed him first before I allowed him the liberty for to dare to appear in your royal presence, and you'll oblige me if you'll just make your mark with your own hand upon the unruly beast's neck." And with that the king, sure enough, drew out his sword and took the head off the dirty brute as clean as a new pin. Well, there was great rejoicing in the court that the dragon was killed, and, says the king to the little waver, says he, "You are a knight-errant as it is, and so it would be no use for to knight you over again, but I will make you a lord," says he. "Oh, Lord," says the waver, thunderstruck like at his own good luck. "I will," says the king, "and as you are the first man I ever heard tell of that rode the dragon, you shall be called Lord Mountdragon," says he. "But that is not all I'll do for you," says the king. "I'll give you my daughter, too, in marriage," says he. Now you see, that was nothing more than what he promised the waver in his first promise. For, by all accounts, the king's daughter was the greatest dragon ever was seen, and had the devil's own tongue, and a beard a yard long, which she pretended was put on her by way of a penance by Father Mulcahy, her confessor, but it was well known it was in the family for ages, and no wonder it was so long by reason of that same.
When O'Connor was king over Ireland, he was living in Rathcrowan of Connacht. He had one son, but he, when he grew up, was wild, and the king could not control him because he would have his own will in everything. One morning he went out, his hound at his foot, his hawk on his hand, his fine black horse to bear him, and he went forward, singing a verse of song to himself until he came as far as a big bush that was growing on the brink of a glen. There was a grey old man sitting at the foot of the bush, and he said, "King's son, if you're able to play as well as you're able to sing songs, I would like to play a game with you." The king's son thought that it was a silly old man that was in it, and he alighted, threw bridle over branch, and sat down by the side of the grey old man. The old man drew out a pack of cards and asked, "Can you play these?" "I can," said the king's son. "What shall we play for?" asked the grey old man. "Anything you wish," says the king's son. "All right. If I win, you must do for me anything I shall ask of you, and if you win, I must do for you anything you ask of me," says the grey old man. "I'm satisfied," said the king's son. They played the game, and the king's son beat the grey old man. Then he said, "What would you like me to do for you, king's son?" "I won't ask you to do anything for me," says the king's son. "I think you're not able to do much." "Don't mind that," said the old man. "You must ask me to do something. I never lost a bet yet that I wasn't able to pay it." As I said, the king's son thought it was a silly old man that was in it, and to satisfy him he said to him, "Take the head off my stepmother and put a goat's head on her for a week." "I'll do that for you," said the grey old man. The king's son went a-riding on his horse, his hound at his foot, his hawk on his hand, and he faced for another place, and never thought more about the grey old man until he came home. He found a cry and great grief in the castle. The servants told him that an enchanter had come into the room where the queen was and had put a goat's head on her head in place of her own head. "By my hand, but that's a wonderful thing," said the king's son. "If I'd have been at home, I'd have whipped the head off him with my sword." There was great grief on the king, and he sent for a wise counselor and asked him did he know how the thing happened to the queen. "Indeed, I cannot tell you that," said he. "It's a work of enchantment." The king's son did not let on that he had any knowledge of the matter. But on the morrow morning he went out, his hound at his foot, his hawk on his hand, and his fine black horse to bear him. And he never drew rein until he came as far as the big bush on the brink of the glen. The gray old man was sitting there under the bush and said, "King's son, will you have a game today?" The king's son got down and said, "I will." With that he threw bridle over branch and sat down by the side of the old man. He drew out the cards and asked the king's son did he get the thing he had won yesterday. "It's all right," said the king's son. "We'll play for the same bet today," says the gray old man. "I'm satisfied," said the king's son. They played. The king's son won. "What would you like me to do for you this time?" says the gray old man. The king's son thought and said to himself, "I'll give him a hard job this time." Then he said, "There's a field of 7 acres at the back of my father's castle. Let it be filled tomorrow morning with cows, and no 2 of them to be of one color or one height or one age." "That shall be done," says the gray old man. The king's son went riding on his horse, his hound at his foot, his hawk at his hand, and faced for home. The king was sorrowful about the queen. There were doctors out of every place in Ireland, but they could not do her any good. In the morning of the next day, the king's herd went out early, and he saw the field at the back of the castle filled with cows, and no 2 of them of the same color, the same age, or the same height. He went in and told the king the wonderful news. "Go and drive them out," says the king. The herd got men and went with them driving out the cows, but no sooner would he put them out on one side than they would come in on the other. The herd went to the king again and told him that all the men that were in Ireland would not be able to put out those cows that were in the field. "They're enchanted cows," says the king. When the king's son saw the cows, he said to himself, "I'll have another game with the gray old man today." That morning he went out, his hound at his foot, his hawk on his hand, and his fine black horse to bear him, and he never drew rein till he came as far as the big bush on the brink of the glen. The gray old man was there before him, and asked him would he have a game of cards. "I will," says the king's son, "but you know well that I can beat you playing cards." "We'll have another game then," says the gray old man. "Did you ever play ball?" "I did indeed," said the king's son, "but I think that you are too old to play ball, and besides that, we have no place here to play it." "If you're contented to play, I'll find a place," says the gray old man. "I'm contented," said the king's son. "Follow me," says the gray old man. The king's son followed him through the glen until he came to a fine green hill. There he drew out a little enchanted rod, spoke some words which the king's son did not understand, and after a moment the hill opened up, and the 2 went in, and they passed through a number of splendid halls until they came out into a garden. There was everything finer than another in that garden, and at the bottom of the garden there was a place for playing ball. They threw up a piece of silver to see who would have hand in, and the gray old man got it. They began then, and the gray old man never stopped until he won out the game. The king's son didn't know what he would do. At last he asked the old man what would he desire him to do for him. "I am king over the black desert, and you must find out myself and my dwelling place within a year and a day, or I shall find you out, and you shall lose your head." Then he brought the king's son out the same way by which he went in. The green hill closed behind them, and the gray old man disappeared from sight. The king's son went home, riding on his horse, his hound at his foot, his hawk on his hand, and he sorrowful enough. That evening the king observed that there was grief and great trouble on his young son, and when he went to sleep the king and every person that was in the castle heard heavy sighings and ravings from him. The king was in grief, a goat's head to be on the queen, but he was 7 times worse when they told him the whole story, how it happened from beginning to end. He sent for a wise counselor and asked him did he know where the king of the Black Desert was living. "I do not indeed," said he, "but as sure as there's a tail on the cat, unless the young heir finds out that enchanter, he will lose his head." There was great grief that day in the castle of the king. There was a goat's head on the queen, and the king's son was going to search for an enchanter without knowing whether he would ever come back. After a week, the goat's head was taken off the queen, and her own head was put upon her. When she heard of how the goat's head was put upon her, a great hate came into her against the king's son, and she said that he may never come back, alive or dead. Of a Monday morning, he left his blessing with his father and his kindred. His traveling bag was bound upon his shoulder, and he went, his hound at his foot, his hawk on his hand, and his fine black horse to bear him. He walked that day until the sun was gone beneath the shadow of the hills, until the darkness of the night was coming, without knowing where he could get lodgings. He noticed a large wood on his left-hand side, and he drew towards it as quickly as he could, hoping to spend the night under the shelter of the trees. He sat down at the foot of a large oak tree and opened his traveling bag to take some food and drink, when he saw a great eagle coming toward him. "Do not be afraid of me, king's son. I know you. You are the son of O'Connor, king of Ireland. I am a friend, and if you give me your horse to give to eat to 4 hungry birds that I have, I shall bear you further than your horse would bear you, and, perhaps, I would put you on the track of him you are looking for." "You can have the horse, and welcome," said the king's son, "although I am sorrowful at parting from him." "All right. I shall be here tomorrow at sunrise." With that, she opened her great gob, caught hold of the horse, struck in his 2 sides against one another, took wing, and disappeared out of sight. The king's son ate and drank his enough, put his traveling bag under his head, and it was not long till he was asleep, and he never awoke until the eagle came and said, "It is time for us to be going. There is a long journey before us. Take hold of your bag and leap upon my back." "But to my grief," says he, "I must part from my hound and my hawk." "Do not be grieved," says she. "They will be here before you when you come back." Then he leapt on her back. She took wing, and off and away with her through the air. She brought him across hills and hollows, over a great sea, and over woods, till he thought that he was at the end of the world. When the sun was going under the shadow of the hills, she came to earth in the midst of a great desert, and said to him, "Follow the path on your right-hand side, and it will bring you to the house of a friend. I must return again to provide for my birds." He followed the path, and it was not long till he came to the house, and he went in. There was a grey old man sitting in the corner. He rose and said, "100,000 welcomes to you, king's son, from Rathcrogan of Connaught." "I have no knowledge of you," said the king's son. "I was acquainted with your grandfather," says the grey old man. "Sit down. No doubt there is hunger and thirst on you." "I'm not free from them," said the king's son. The old man then smote his 2 palms against one another, and 2 servants came and laid a board with beef, mutton, pork, and plenty of bread before the king's son, and the old man said to him, "Eat and drink your enough. Perhaps it may be a long time before you get the like again." He ate and drank as much as he desired, and thanked him for it. Then the old man said, "You are going seeking for the king of the Black Desert. Go to sleep now, and I will go through my books to see if I can find out the dwelling place of that king." Then he smote his palms together, and a servant came, and he told him, "Take the king's son to his chamber." He took him to a fine chamber, and it was not long till he fell asleep. On the morning of the next day, the old man came and said, "Rise up. There is a long journey before you. You must do 500 miles before midday." "I could not do it," said the king's son.
If you are a good rider, I will give you a horse that will bring you over the journey." "I will do as you say," says the king's son.
The old man gave him plenty to eat and drink, and, when he was satisfied, gave him a little white garron, and said, "Give the garron his head, and when he stops to look up into the air, and you will see 3 swans as white as snow. These are the 3 daughters of the king of the Black Desert. There will be a green napkin in the mouth of one of them. That is the youngest daughter, and there is not anyone alive except her who could bring you to the house of the king of the Black Desert. When the garron stops, you will be near a lake. The 3 swans will come to land on the brink of that lake, and they will make 3 young women of themselves, and they will go into the lake swimming and dancing. Keep your eye on the green napkin, and when you get the young women into the lake, go and get the napkin, and do not part with it. Go into hiding under a tree, and when the young women will come out, 2 of them will make swans of themselves and will go away in the air. And then the youngest daughter will say, 'I will do anything for him who will give me my napkin.' Come forward then and give her the napkin, and say there is nothing you want but to bring you to her father's house, and tell her you are a king's son from a powerful country." The king's son did everything as the old man desired him, and when he gave the napkin to the daughter of the king of the Black Desert, he said, "I am the son of O'Connor, king of Connacht. Bring me to your father. Long am I seeking him." "Would it not be better for me to do something else for you?" said she.
"I do not want anything else," said he.
"If I show you the house, will you not be satisfied?" said she.
"I will be satisfied," said he.
"Now," said she, "upon your life, do not tell my father that it was I who brought you to his house, and I shall be a good friend to you. But let on," said she, "that you have great powers of enchantment."
"I will do as you say," says he.
Then she made a swan of herself and said, "Leap up on my back and put your hands under my neck and keep a handhold." He did so, and she shook her wings, and off and away with her over hills and over glens, over sea and over mountains, until she came to earth as the sun was going under. And then she said to him, "Do you see that great house yonder? That is my father's house. Farewell. Any time that you are in danger, I shall be at your side." Then she went from him. The king's son went to the house and went in, and who should he see sitting in a golden chair but the gray old man who had played the cards and the ball with him.
"King's son," said he, "I see that you have found me out before the day and the year. How long since you left home?"
"This morning, when I was rising out of my bed, I saw a rainbow. I gave a leap, spread my 2 legs on it, and slid as far as this."
"By my hand, it was a great feat you performed," said the old king.
"I could do a more wonderful thing than that if I chose," said the king's son.
"I have 3 things for you to do," says the old king, "and if you are able to do them, you shall have the choice of my 3 daughters for a wife. And unless you are able to do them, you shall lose your head, as a good many other young men have lost it before you." Then he said, "There be's neither eating nor drinking in my house, except once in the week, and we had it this morning."
"It's all one to me," said the king's son. "I could fast for a month if I were on a pinch."
"No doubt you can go without sleep also," says the old king.
"I can, without a doubt," said the king's son.
"You shall have a hard bed tonight, then," says the old king. "Come with me till I show it to you."
He brought him out then and showed him a great tree with a fork in it, and said,
"Get up there and sleep in the fork, and be ready with the rise of the sun."
He went up into the fork, but as soon as the old king was asleep, the young daughter came and brought him into a fine room, and kept him there until the old king was about to rise. Then she put him out again into the fork of the tree. With the rise of the sun, the old king came to him and said,
"Come down now and come with me until I show you the thing you have to do today."
He brought the king's son to the brink of a lake and showed him an old castle and said to him,
"Throw every stone in that castle out into the loch, and let you have it done before the sun goes down in the evening."
He went away from him then. The king's son began working, but the stones were stuck to one another so fast that he was not able to raise one of them, and if he were to be working until this day, there would not be one stone out of the castle. He sat down then, thinking what he ought to do, and it was not long until the daughter of the old king came to him and said, "What is the cause of your grief?" He told her the work which he had to do. "Let that put no grief on you. I will do it," said she. Then she gave him bread, meat, and wine, pulled out a little enchanted rod, struck a blow on the old castle, and, in a moment, every stone of it was at the bottom of the lake. "Now," said she, "do not tell my father that it was I who did the work for you." When the sun was going down in the evening, the old king came and said,
"I see that you have your day's work done."
"I have," said the king's son. "I can do any work at all." The old king thought now that the king's son had great powers of enchantment, and he said to him,
"Your day's work for tomorrow is to lift the stones out of the loch and to set up the castle again as it was before."
He brought the king's son home and said to him,
"Go to sleep in the place where you were last night."
When the old king went to sleep, the young daughter came and brought him into the fine chamber and kept him there till the old king was about to rise in the morning. Then she put him out again in the fork of the tree. At sunrise, the old king came and said,
"It's time for you to get to work."
"There's no hurry on me at all," says the king's son, "because I know I can readily do my day's work." He then went to the brink of the lake, but he was not able to see a stone, the water was that black. He sat down on a rock, and it was not long until Fionnuala, that was the name of the old king's daughter, came to him and said, "What have you to do today?" He told her, and she said, "Let there be no grief on you. I can do that work for you." Then she gave him bread, beef, mutton, and wine. After that she drew out the little enchanted rod, smote the water of the lake with it, and in a moment the old castle was set up as it had been the day before. Then she said to him, "On your life, don't tell my father that I did this work for you, or that you have any knowledge of me at all." On the evening of that day the old king came and said,
"I see that you have the day's work done."
"I have," said the king's son. "That was an easy done job." Then the old king thought that the king's son had more power of enchantment than he had himself, and he said,
"You have only one other thing to do."
He brought him home then and put him to sleep in the fork of the tree, but Fionnuala came and put him into the fine chamber, and in the morning she sent him out again into the tree. At sunrise the old king came to him and said,
"Come with me till I show you your day's work."
He brought the king's son to a great glen and showed him a well and said,
"My grandmother lost a ring in that well, and do you get it for me before the sun goes under this evening."
Now, this well was 100 feet deep and 20 feet round about, and it was filled with water, and there was an army out of hell watching the ring. When the old king went away, Fionnuala came and asked, "What have you to do today?" He told her, and she said, "That is a difficult task, but I shall do my best to save your life." Then she gave him beef, bread, and wine. Then she made a diver of herself and went down into the well. It was not long till he saw smoke and lightning coming up out of the well, and he heard a sound like thunder, and anyone who would be listening to that noise would think that the army of hell was fighting. At the end of a while the smoke went away, the lightning and thunder ceased, and Fionnuala came up with the ring. She handed the ring to the king's son and said, "I won the battle, and your life is saved. But look, the little finger of my right hand is broken. But perhaps it's a lucky thing that it was broken. When my father comes, do not give him the ring, but threaten him stoutly. He will bring you then to choose your wife, and this is how you shall make your choice. I and my sisters will be in a room. There will be a hole in the door, and we shall all put our hands out in a cluster. You will put your hand through the hole, and the hand that you will keep hold of when my father will open the door, that is the hand of her you shall have for wife. You can know me by my broken little finger.
I can, and the love of my heart you are, Fionnuala, says the king's son.
On the evening of that day, the old king came and said,
Did you get my grandmother's ring? I did indeed, said the king's son. There was an army out of hell guarding it, but I beat them, and I would beat 7 times as many. Don't you know I'm a Connacht man? Give me the ring, says the old king. Indeed I won't give it, says he. I fought hard for it. But do you give me my wife. I want to be going.
The old king brought him in and said,
My 3 daughters are in that room before you. The hand of each of them is stretched out, and she on whom you will keep your hold until I open the door, that one is your wife.
The king's son thrust his hand through the hole that was in the door and caught hold of the hand with the broken little finger and kept a tight hold of it until the king opened the door of the room.
This is my wife, said the king's son. Give me now your daughter's fortune. She has no fortune to get, but the brown slender steed to bring you home, and that ye may never come back, alive or dead.
The king's son and Fionnuala went riding on the brown slender steed, and it was not long till they came to the wood where the king's son left his hound and his hawk. They were there before him, together with his fine black horse. He sent the brown slender steed back then. He set Fionnuala riding on his horse, and leapt up himself, his hound at his heel, his hawk at his hand, and he never stopped till he came to Rathcrogan. There was great welcome before him there, and it was not long till himself and Fionnuala were married. They spent a long, prosperous life. But it is scarcely that even the track of this old castle is to be found today in Rathcrogan of Connacht. At Tai Yan there lived a man named Wang. One morning he was out walking when he met a young lady carrying a bundle and hurrying along by herself. As she moved along with some difficulty, impeded of course by her bound feet, this practice is said to have originated about A.D. 970 with Yao Niang, the concubine of the pretender Li Yu, who wished to make her feet like the new moon. The Manchu or Tartar ladies never adopted this custom, and therefore the empresses of modern times have had feet of the natural size. Neither is it in force among the Hakkas or among the hill tribes of China and Formosa and others. The practice was forbidden in 1664 by the Manchu Emperor Qiangxi, but popular feeling was so strong on the subject that 4 years afterwards the prohibition was withdrawn. A vigorous attempt is now being made to secure natural feet for the Chinese girl, with more chance of success. As she moved along with some difficulty, Wang quickened his pace and caught her up, and found she was a pretty girl of about 16. Much smitten, he inquired whither she was going so early, and no one with her. "A traveler like you," replied the girl, "cannot alleviate my distress. Why trouble yourself to ask?" "What distress is it?" said Wang. "I'm sure I'll do anything I can for you." "My parents," answered she, "loved money, and they sold me as a concubine into a rich family where the wife was very jealous and beat and abused me morning and night. It was more than I could stand, so I have run away." Wang asked her where she was going, to which she replied that a runaway had no fixed place of abode. "My house," said Wang, "is at no great distance. What do you say to coming there?" She joyfully acquiesced, and Wang, taking up her bundle, led the way to his house. Finding no one there, she asked Wang where his family were, to which he replied that this was only the library. "And a very nice place, too," said she. "But if you are kind enough to wish to save my life, you mustn't let it be known that I am here." Wang promised he would not divulge her secret, and so she remained there for some days without anyone knowing anything about it. He then told his wife, and she, fearing the girl might belong to some influential family, advised him to send her away. This, however, he would not consent to do. When one day, going into the town, he met a Taoist priest who looked at him in astonishment and asked him what he had met. "I have met nothing," replied Wang. "Why," said the priest, "you are bewitched. What do you mean by not having met anything?" But Wang insisted that it was so, and the priest walked away, saying, "The fool! Some people don't seem to know when death is at hand." This startled Wang, who at first thought of the girl, but then he reflected that a pretty young thing as she was couldn't well be a witch, and began to suspect that the priest merely wanted to do a stroke of business. When he returned, the library door was shut, and he couldn't get in, which made him suspect that something was wrong, and so he climbed over the wall, where he found the door of the inner room shut too. Softly creeping up, he looked through the window and saw a hideous devil with a green face and jagged teeth like a saw, spreading a human skin upon the bed and painting it with a paintbrush. The devil then threw aside the brush and, giving the skin a shake-out just as you would a coat, threw it over its shoulders when, lo, it was the girl. Terrified at this, Wang hurried away with his head down in search of the priest, who had gone he knew not whither, subsequently finding him in the fields, where he threw himself on his knees and begged the priest to save him. "As to driving her away," said the priest, "the creature must be in great distress to be seeking a substitute for herself. Besides, I could hardly endure to injure a living thing." The disembodied spirits of the Chinese inferno are permitted, under certain conditions of time and good conduct, to appropriate to themselves the vitality of some human being, who, as it were, exchanges places with the so-called devil. The devil does not, however, reappear as the mortal whose life it has become possessed of, but is merely born again into the world. The idea being that the amount of life on earth is a constant quantity and cannot be increased or diminished, reminding one, in a way, of the great modern doctrine of the conservation of energy. This curious belief has an important bearing that will be brought out in a subsequent story. Here again is a Taoist priest quoting the Buddhist commandment, "Thou shalt not take life." The Buddhist laity in China, who do not hesitate to take life for the purposes of food, salve their consciences from time to time by buying birds, fishes, etc., and letting them go, in the hope that such acts will be set down on the credit side of their record of good and evil. "As to driving her away," said the priest, "the creature must be in great distress to be seeking a substitute for herself. Besides, I could hardly endure to injure a living thing." However, he gave Wang a fly brush and bade him hang it at the door of the bedroom, agreeing to meet again at the Qing-Ti temple. Wang went home, but did not dare enter the library, so he hung up the brush at the bedroom door, and before long heard a sound of footsteps outside. Not daring to move, he made his wife peep out, and she saw the girl standing looking at the brush, afraid to pass it. She then ground her teeth and went away, but in a little while came back and began cursing, saying, "You priest, you won't frighten me. Do you think I am going to give up what is already in my grasp?" Thereupon she tore the brush to pieces and, bursting open the door, walked straight up to the bed, where she ripped open Wang and tore out his heart, with which she went away. Wang's wife screamed out, and the servant came in with a light, but Wang was already dead and presented a most miserable spectacle. His wife, who was in an agony of fright, hardly dared cry for fear of making a noise, and the next day she sent Wang's brother to see the priest. The latter got into a great rage and cried out, "Was it for this that I had compassion on you, devil that you are?" Proceeding at once with Wang's brother to the house, from which the girl had disappeared without anyone knowing whither she had gone. But the priest, raising his head, looked all around and said, "Luckily, she's not far off." He then asked who lived in the apartments on the south side, to which Wang's brother replied that he did, whereupon the priest declared that there she would be found. Wang's brother was horribly frightened and said he didn't think so. And then the priest asked him if any stranger had been to the house. To this he answered that he had been out to the Ching Ti temple and couldn't possibly say, but he went off to inquire, and in a little while came back and reported that an old woman had sought service with them as a maid-of-all-work and had been engaged by his wife. "That is she," said the priest, as Wang's brother added she was still there, and they all set out to go to the house together. Then the priest took his wooden sword and, standing in the middle of the courtyard, shouted out, "Base-born fiend, give me back my fly brush!" Meanwhile, the new maid-of-all-work was in a great state of alarm and tried to get away by the door, but the priest struck her down and she fell flat, the human skin dropped off, and she became a hideous devil. There she lay, grunting like a pig, until the priest grasped his wooden sword and struck off her head. She then became a dense column of smoke curling up from the ground when the priest took an uncorked gourd and threw it right into the midst of the smoke. A sucking noise was heard, and the whole column was drawn into the gourd, after which the priest corked it up closely and put it in his pouch. The skin, too, which was complete even to the eyebrows, eyes, hands, and feet, he also rolled up as if it had been a scroll, and was on the point of leaving with it, when Wang's wife stopped him and with tears entreated him to bring her husband to life. The priest said he was unable to do that, but Wang's wife flung herself at his feet and with loud lamentations implored his assistance. For some time he remained immersed in thought, and then replied, "My power is not equal to what you ask. I myself cannot raise the dead, but I will direct you to someone who can, and if you apply to him properly, you will succeed." Wang's wife asked the priest who it was, to which he replied, "There is a maniac in the town who passes his time groveling in the dirt. Go, prostrate yourself before him, and beg him to help you. If he insults you, show no sign of anger." Wang's brother knew the man to whom he alluded, and accordingly bade the priest adieu and proceeded thither with his sister-in-law. They found the destitute creature raving away by the roadside, so filthy that it was all they could do to go near him. Wang's wife approached him on her knees, at which the maniac leered at her and cried out, "Do you love me, my beauty?" Wang's wife told him what she had come for, but he only laughed and said, "You could get plenty of other husbands. Why raise the dead one to life?" But Wang's wife entreated him to help her, whereupon he observed, "It is very strange. People apply to me to raise their dead as if I was the king of the infernal regions." He then gave Wang's wife a thrashing with his staff, which she bore without a murmur and before a gradually increasing crowd of spectators. After this, he produced a loathsome pill which he told her she must swallow, but here she broke down and was quite unable to do so. However, she did manage it at last, and then the maniac, crying out, "How you do love me!" got up and went away without taking any more notice of her. They followed him into a temple with loud supplications, but he had disappeared, and every effort to find him was unsuccessful. Overcome with rage and shame, Wang's wife went home, where she mourned bitterly over her dead husband, grievously repenting the step she had taken and wishing only to die. She then bethought herself of preparing the corpse, near which none of the servants would venture, and set to work to close up the frightful wound of which he died. While thus employed, interrupted from time to time by her sobs, she felt a rising lump in her throat, which by and by came out with a pop and fell straight into the dead man's wound. Looking closely at it, she saw it was a human heart, and then it began, as it were, to throb, emitting a warm vapor like smoke. Much excited, she at once closed the flesh over it and held the sides of the wound together with all her might. Very soon, however, she got tired, and finding the vapor escaping from the crevices, she tore up a piece of silk and bound it round, at the same time bringing back circulation by rubbing the body and covering it up with clothes. In the night she removed the coverings and found that breath was coming from the nose, and by the next morning her husband was alive again, though disturbed in mind as if awaking from a dream and feeling a pain in his heart. Where he had been wounded, there was a cicatrix about as big as a cash. which soon after disappeared. In a country far, far away, there once lived a great and powerful king who had 3 sons, all of whom he loved as dearly as a father can love his children. The 2 older ones were very handsome and intelligent, while the youngest was of little account. Peter was his name, and, as a rule, his brothers and comrades made a fool of him whenever they saw their chance. They called him Peter Humbug. The king, however, liked them all equally well, and when he reached old age he did not know how to avoid wronging 2 of them by electing one as the successor to the throne. In those days it was a custom with the kings to extend a heavy iron chain all around the palace in order to prevent the common people from running into the courtyard. The chain, which was now serving that purpose, had become so well worn, however, by rust and wear, that the king thought seriously of having a new one made. As he was a wise man who always knew how to manage his affairs easily and suitably, he thought that here was an opportunity to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, namely, at one time to decide who would be his successor and to secure a new chain for the palace. Therefore he said to the princes, "Now you must all 3 set out for the purpose of getting a new chain for the palace. A year from today you shall return, and he who brings the longest chain will be my successor to the throne after my death." The 2 oldest boys at once departed. The one secured work with the ablest blacksmith he could find, while the other, who considered himself much more clever than his brother, was engaged by a coppersmith, thinking that copper could be worked more easily than iron. Peter Humbug was for some time uncertain whether he wished to depart or not. He thought that his brothers were more able and skilled than he, but when the king told him to do his best, he trudged away. Of course, he had no idea what to do or how to make such a chain as his father wished, so he walked straight into the country until he entered a large forest where, at length, he lost his way. Evening and night found him walking amongst the trees. At length he discovered a light shining in the distance, and when he followed the direction towards it, he finally reached a small hut. Having knocked at the door, he heard someone call, "Come in," whereupon he opened it and crossed the threshold. Imagine his surprise when he found no one within except a big white cat seated comfortably in a chair. Supposing that no one but the cat could have responded to his knock, he turned to her, inquiring if he could secure a resting place in the house. The cat told him that he was welcome. "But," she added, "since you come so late, you are no doubt hungry." Peter Humbug replied that there was some truth in that, and the cat now proceeded to tell him where to find what he needed to eat, whereupon Peter did justice to the viands. When the meal was finished, the cat pointed to a bed, telling him that he might go to sleep whenever he desired. Tired as he was, he soon slept soundly. Next morning, the cat expressed her wish to know who he was and where he was going. Peter told all, adding that he had, beforehand, given up the hope of securing such a long chain. In fact, he knew not where to find or how to procure it. "If you will serve me," said the cat, "you shall have nothing to do but wash and comb me 3 times every day. Of course you will receive no wages, and the meals will be exactly like the one which you had last night." "That might be well enough after all," answered Peter. "Time will pass then until the year comes around." He stayed with the white cat, washed and combed her 3 times a day, and passed the rest of his time in the woods. When the year had passed, the cat said, "Now you must return home, Peter. Both of your brothers will do the same." But Peter did not care to do so, since he could carry no chain with him. "You must do it anyway," said the cat, "and I promise to give you a chain which is better than those of both of your brothers. Carry home the chest which you see standing in the hall, and when your brothers have showed their chains,
you must open this chest, which contains a chain longer and better in every respect than all others."
Peter thanked the cat, bid her goodbye, took the chest, and left the little house in the forest. When he reached home, his brothers had already arrived. The king proceeded to ask the oldest to produce his chain. The young man opened a strong coffer and pulled out a heavy iron chain, which he tried in the place reserved for it. It held the exact measure and was in every respect satisfactory. Then the second oldest came with his masterpiece, a copper chain which reached twice round the palace.
"Now, Peter," said the king, addressing his youngest son, "let us see what you have brought."
Opening his chest, the boy drew out a very heavy chain made of pure gold, which held 3 times the right measure. Everyone agreed with the king that Peter had done best of all, because his chain was not only the longest, but also a costly treasure. The 2 older brothers were by no means content with the result of the contest. They had been sure of winning the prize, and considered Peter Humbug a poor fellow to manage a kingdom. So at length they contrived to induce the king to send them away once more, this time for the purpose of getting money. He who returned with the largest amount of money was to inherit the kingdom. The king assented, and the brothers departed, Peter Humbug the last, like the year before. The 2 older brothers considered themselves sure of winning this time, for it takes a clever man to earn much money, and Peter could not at all boast of being clever. The oldest brother became a merchant and gained 100% on all that he sold. The other established himself as a money lender, extorting money from unfortunate people in a sinful manner. Peter was not sure of what he wished to do. As he went along in deep thought, he chanced to find once more the little house in the forest, where he was again received by the white cat. He stayed there all night, and next morning the cat asked him whether he was willing to stay another year on the same conditions as before. He assented, and during the whole year he washed and combed the cat 3 times a day, passing the remainder of his time among the trees. Time passed rapidly, and before Peter knew, the year had passed. "Now you must return home, Peter," said the cat one day. "Your brothers have gone back already." Peter objected, as he had no money. "Take with you the chest which you will find in the hall," said the cat. "It contains money enough." When Peter arrived, his brothers were there already, and the king now asked them to show how much they had managed to gain. The oldest son had been clever enough to gather his money in copper coin, thinking he would have most, both in regard to weight and to number. He had so much that he covered nearly 1/2 the floor in the largest room with his money. The second oldest son came next. He had silver coin enough to cover the remaining part of the floor. Finally, Peter came in. "Well, Peter Humbug," cried they, "can you bid higher?" Peter thought he could not, and he who had the silver money began already to rejoice. Soon, however, Peter had opened his chest and emptied its contents upon the floor. He spread it over the copper and the silver, and when he had finished this work, behold, no copper or silver piece was visible, but the whole floor glittered and sparkled with Peter Humbug's gold.
"Peter is the victor this time as well," declared the king, "and now it is certain that he will inherit the throne."
Peter's 2 brothers were not pleased to hear this. They objected that he was not competent enough for this responsible position, and finally they proposed that their father should allow them to seek a wife. He who returned within 1 year with the prettiest wife should be successor to the throne. Although the king was not altogether pleased with this proposition, mainly for Peter's sake, he assented, especially as Peter himself made no objection. The 2 brothers thought that this time it was quite impossible for Peter to win. What princess in the world would care to marry a person like Peter Humbug? Peter trudged along, but where should he go to find a pretty wife? He speculated and speculated, hardly knowing whither he was going, until he found himself again at the hut in the forest. Having knocked at the door and heard the cat call, "Come in," he ate and slept, and next morning the animal asked him why he had returned again. Peter told her that he was seeking a wife, but did not know how to find one. When the cat heard the circumstances, she said that he had better stay where he was. Peter did not know whether it would be of any use to him, as he had never seen a single human being around this place, and he must, of course, seek a beautiful princess, or some person of high rank and great beauty. But, as the cat had helped him so well the 2 previous times, he followed her advice, however, and consented to stay on the same conditions as before. One day passed like the other. When the cat was washed and combed, Peter was at liberty to roam about the woods to his heart's content. Time flew so rapidly that he was taken by surprise when one day the cat told him that a year had passed and that he must return home, as both of his brothers were already there, each with his bride. Peter thought there was time enough, as he had not yet found a bride himself. "You have served me faithfully for 3 years," said the cat, "and therefore I am determined to help you this time also. You must promise, however, to do exactly as I tell you." Yes, Peter was ready to do whatever she wished. "Take your knife," pursued the cat, "and cut my head off. As soon as you have done this, strip off my skin." Peter said he could not do this, as she had always treated him so kindly. "You must do it nevertheless," returned the cat, "if you wish matters to end well." Thus Peter was obliged to obey. But as soon as he had cut off her head and begun to skin her, a beautiful princess stood before him with a crown on her hair. She told him how an evil power had doomed her to remain in the shape of a cat until a prince declared himself willing to serve her for 3 years. "And," added she, "as you have done so, I am freed from the witchcraft and ready to return home with you." Peter was, of course, both surprised and pleased to see the beautiful princess appear before him, but he was much more delighted to learn that she was willing to become his wife. Now he must surely win the contest, for a prettier princess he had never seen in all his life. "Let us enter the golden carriage which is waiting in front of the house," said the princess. "During our journey, I will tell you more about myself." They entered the vehicle, and while Peter drove the horses, brandishing the whip over the animals to his heart's content, in boundless joy, the princess related her story. "My father was once a great and mighty king, and he lived happily with my mother until she fell sick and died, whereupon my father married a queen who was a widow with 1 daughter. But this stepmother of mine was a witch, and when she realized that I was prettier than her own daughter, she was afraid that I might stand in her way. Therefore, she converted me into the shape of a white cat and forced me to live alone in this large forest until you came and released me. And so I have a 2-fold reason for liking you." Peter looked at the young princess, and, as she smiled sweetly at him, he stopped the horses in the middle of the forest to kiss her. They soon reached the palace. On the front steps, the old king and his 2 older sons, with their wives, were standing, anxious to know who could afford to drive in such luxury. When the carriage stopped below the steps, they recognized Peter. He jumped from his seat, helping the princess to alight, and as soon as they had glanced at her, they all admitted that she was the most beautiful. The 2 other princesses were very pretty girls, but their beauty did by no means reach that of Peter Humbug's fair and graceful bride. It was thus decided that Peter should inherit the throne. He did so, in fact, shortly afterwards, when the old king had died, and his marriage with the princess had been celebrated with great splendor. Evidently he was a much better man than people expected him to be, for he ruled his land wisely and well. He was much beloved by his people. But the 2 older brothers went away to other countries, and no one ever knew what became of them.